I'm Diana Falzone for Fox 411. The hit show Gold Rush follows ambitious gold miners looking to make it big one nugget at a time.
In the Yukon, machines are rented by the hour, and money usually comes first. But Parker Schnabel is about to break that rule for a man he has not spoken to in 2 years. That man is Rick Ness, who arrives with his season already in trouble. At Duncan Creek, Rick Ness's comeback season is hanging by a thread. He is just one flat tire away from losing a claim he had recently mortgaged himself to buy. Rick expects to negotiate, but he never gets the chance. What Parker offers him could cost Parker money he may never get back, and Rick is almost speechless when he hears it. Yet what makes the moment unforgettable is something Parker says only after Rick's truck has disappeared. The theft that opened the season. The season does not begin with gold. It begins with a theft. Rick Ness has barely returned to the Yukon after spending an entire year away from mining when he discovers that his 10-inch suction line is missing. It has not been misplaced. Someone took it. Rick starts asking questions around the valley, and the information eventually comes through Kyle, a man who once worked for him. A neighboring miner had been seen on the site looking around for a 10-inch suction line. People watched him do it. He loaded the line up and drove away. Rick tracks down Kyle and asks what he saw. Kyle explains that the man had been searching for a 10-inch suction line and that he personally witnessed him taking it. For anyone who has never worked inside a mining cut, it is easy to underestimate how serious that loss is. A suction line is not just another piece of equipment. It is essentially the artery of the operation. It moves water from the creek to the wash plant. The wash plant depends on that water to separate the heavy gold from the lighter gravel. Without the suction line, there is no water. Without water, the plant cannot run. And if the plant cannot run, there is no gold being recovered, while the fuel costs, wages, equipment payments, and precious daylight continue to disappear. A 10-inch line is also not something a miner can simply replace with a quick trip into town. In the middle of a Yukon season, where roads can become nearly impossible to travel after heavy rain, getting a replacement could take weeks. Even then, there is no guarantee that a truck will arrive when needed. The miner did not simply steal a hose. He stole time, and in the Yukon, time is arguably the most valuable resource a mining season has. Rick decides to make the call himself. There is an edge in his voice that belongs to a man who has already spent an entire year losing things. He tells the miner directly that something belonging to him was taken, and that he wants it returned. But what comes back is almost worse than getting nothing. The stolen line is brought back on a trailer, crushed nearly flat. The basket is badly damaged, and someone has covered parts of it with duct tape, as if a little tape could somehow fix the damage. The miner does not even return it personally. Instead, he sends 2 men to drop it off before they quickly drive away. Rick stands over the wrecked equipment, clearly fighting to keep his temper under control. He says that if the line cannot be used, he will personally drive out there to deal with the situation. That is when Z steps in. He handles the situation carefully. He does not tell Rick that he is wrong or try to lecture him. Instead, he asks a simple question. Which option is the quickest, safest, and least likely to land either of them in jail? Rick takes a breath and lets the anger settle. He stays on the claim rather than acting on impulse, then begins asking the neighboring miners if anyone has a piece of equipment he can borrow. In many ways, that single afternoon captures the entire struggle of the season. Someone takes something Rick Ness desperately needs, and instead of allowing the setback to end his operation, Rick absorbs the loss, controls his anger, and starts looking for someone willing to help. What Rick does not know yet is who will eventually offer that help, or that the season will end as an exact mirror image of the way it began. The first nugget. Rick gets the plant running anyway, and he does it with a crew of just 2 people, himself and Z. Together, they begin sluicing stockpiled pay dirt from the gold-rich Raleigh Valley, material that had been cut just a week after Rick returned to the territory. Rick admits the pressure of running such a small operation, but he also admits something else. Considering the amount of work in front of them, the 2 of them handled it surprisingly quickly, and the plant performed better than he had expected. Then comes the moment the entire year has been building toward. The first clean-out. Rick says he needs to see gold in the box because it has been far too long since he has seen it. Zer spots it first on the left side of the sluice run. It is not a huge amount, but it is there. Real gold sitting in a real box on a claim Rick is finally operating under his own name after being away from mining for 12 months. Rick tells Z that he is proud of him. Z tells Rick that the gold carries more meaning this year. Neither of them pretends that the emotion is only about the size of the piece. Rick describes it as a long journey back and says that he needed this moment. He needed it to mean something. Then he does something that explains so much of what happens later in the season. Rick takes the first piece of gold and pushes it towards Zed. It is not much, but Rick tells him that he deserves it. Z tries to refuse, but Rick will not accept no for an answer. He tells Z that the first piece belongs to him and asks if he wants to take it home. Rick reminds him that he could not have done any of this alone and that he is grateful Z made the trip north with him. Rick becomes emotional, then gets embarrassed about showing those emotions and covers the moment with a joke. Rick Ness gives away the first gold of his comeback before he has even weighed a single ounce for himself. That detail is important because it makes the scene at the center of this story even more surprising. Rick is comfortable giving to other people. What he is not used to is being the person on the receiving end. Everything on the line. After 4 years as a mine boss, Rick has built his future around a 190-foot deep cut. Test drilling suggested there could be as much as $5 million worth of gold beneath the ground. So far, however, the ground has refused to produce anything close to those expectations. Rick is honest about why that scares him. He needs to send his crew home with gold in their pockets, and he needs to make enough for himself as well. As Rick puts it, nobody can survive simply by feeling proud of a giant hole. After moving an incredible 1,000,000 yards of overburden, he is still 800 ounces short of his 2,000-ounce goal. Winter is approaching, and Rick still has not reached the high-grade pay layer that the entire plan depends on. Then, during that crucial week, Troy Taylor arrives without warning. Troy owns the Duncan Creek claims that Rick is leasing, and landowners do not usually show up in the middle of a mining season just to make a friendly visit. Troy tells Rick that he and his father have been receiving inquiries about the property, and they are now considering selling it. But Troy would prefer to sell the claims to Rick. The required down payment is 150 ounces of gold. Rick does the math out loud and immediately understands what that means. It is roughly $250,000 worth of gold that he would have to produce before he has even mined it. That is an enormous demand for someone who has already invested around $500,000 in new equipment and is barely making a profit. And the alternative is even worse than simply being expensive. A leased claim is land that a miner develops at his own expense while still operating under someone else's ownership. Rick has spent years stripping overburden at Duncan Creek, building roads, bringing in heavy equipment, and figuring out exactly where the pay is located. If Troy sells the property to another buyer, everything Rick has invested becomes a benefit for someone else. The new owner would have no obligation to honor Rick's plans or agreements. Rick could lose not only the current season, but years of work that went into developing the ground, and he would be losing it at the exact moment he discovered the property was even up for sale. So Rick starts looking for a way to produce the gold he does not currently have. The only way forward is a gamble. Rick's plan is to operate both wash plants at the same time. Rocky, the older plant, has been sitting idle for 4 weeks since Monster Red went into operation, but Rocky can still process hundreds of yards of gold-rich pay dirt every day. The biggest problem is manpower. Rick is already constantly short-handed, and operating 2 plants at once means one of them will have to be handled by a single person for an entire day. Rick takes the idea to Kyle Lawson, an iron worker from Whitehorse who is only in his 2nd season in the mining world. Before Rick hired him, Kyle had no real background in this kind of work. What Rick is asking him to do is genuinely risky for the operation. Running Rocky alone means constantly moving between the loader and excavator, feeding the plant, monitoring the tailings, and dealing with any backup before it turns into a serious blockage. Because once the plant becomes blocked, everything has to stop. And downtime is the one thing Rick cannot afford. There is nobody standing behind Kyle to catch a mistake, and every hour Rocky remains shut down is another hour of production Rick needs to reach that 150-ounce payment. Kyle admits that he is nervous, but he agrees to take the job anyway. He also explains why he is willing to do it. Rick has shown him a great deal of trust, and that gamble pays off. The week's cleanout produces 119.8 ounces from Rocky. Combined with roughly 220 ounces from Monster Red, Rick pulls around 315 ounces of gold in a single week. That gold is worth more than $500,000 and becomes the biggest weekly gold haul of Rick's career up to that point. With the production he needed finally in hand, Rick drives out to meet Troy and tells him that he is ready to buy the property. The down payment is non-refundable, and the royalty payments will continue into the following season. Rick understands exactly what he is committing to. He has just paid to secure ground that he can finally call his own, but in doing so, he has spent nearly everything he has. One flat tire. Then one flat tire changes everything. Eel goes home, leaving Rick with only one other crew member on site, Morgan Lauren. Morgan is a newcomer to gold mining and is operating a rented loader that is so old it does not even have a front cab. She spends the day dealing with dirt and dust coming off the machine's own tires, and she openly admits that having newer equipment would make life easier if anything suitable could even be found in the area. Then the machine starts leaning. Morgan calls it in over the radio. The loader has a flat tire, and the plant is about to go down. One tire is enough to bring the entire operation to a standstill. The reason a single flat tire can cause such a massive problem is easy to miss because it looks like a minor mechanical issue, but on a mining operation, it can bring everything to a complete stop. The loader is the only machine feeding material into the wash plant. The loader scoops pay dirt from the stockpile and drops it into the hopper. From there, everything else in the operation, the water, the screens, the sluice runs, and the mats designed to catch the gold, exists to process whatever the loader feeds into the plant. When the loader stops, the entire plant begins starving within minutes. The crew is left standing around, but the fuel costs continue. The wages continue. The expenses do not stop just because the equipment does. And in the Yukon, a mining season is not really measured in months. It is measured by a short window of weeks before the ground freezes and the season ends, whether the gold has been recovered or not. Rick does not have a spare loader. All he has is an old rented machine that he already does not trust, and after handing over his gold for the claim, buying a dependable replacement is not a realistic option. Rick says he needs to find a tire, find another loader, or find some kind of solution. He knows the machine he has is not good enough for the rest of the season. He needs equipment he can depend on. Then he says a name he has not mentioned in 2 years. He wants to see Parker. 2 years of silence stand between them, and the history of those two men is not a small detail. It is exactly what gives the next meeting so much weight. When Parker Schnabel was just 17 years old, he hired Rick Ness to help him work a small gold claim. Rick was there from the very beginning and became an important part of Parker's development as a serious mining operator. Eventually, Rick rose to become Parker's foreman. For years, they worked through long days together, keeping the machines running and making sure the wash plant was constantly fed. For a long time, Rick Ness was one of the people Parker relied on most, but eventually their relationship fell apart. The exchanges that remained from the end of their partnership were harsh in the way arguments become harsh when they involve people who once meant a lot to each other. Parker accused Rick of acting like a child. Rick told Parker that he was turning him into an enemy and that this was never what he wanted. Eventually, Rick made it clear that he was simply tired of the entire situation. Rick left to become his own boss, saying he had an opportunity and intended to take it. Then there was silence. 2 full years passed without the two men speaking. Now Rick is driving back to that same man, essentially asking him for help. And what makes the situation even more difficult is that Rick is not simply asking for a favor. He is asking after spending an entire year away from mining. He has no idea what kind of Parker he is about to meet. Rick has heard that Parker bought another mine, Dominion Creek, along with roughly $2 million worth of equipment already sitting on the property. That is Rick's entire plan. After 2 years without speaking, he is going to show up and hope that one of Parker's machines is a loader he can use. During the drive, Rick talks himself through the situation. He admits that the two of them have a long history and that not all of it is good. He says he is looking forward to seeing Parker and hopes Parker feels the same way. But then Rick admits something more honest. He genuinely does not know. He wonders what Parker may have heard about everything that happened during the past 2 years. He does not know what rumors may have reached him or what Parker thinks about him now. That is the honest state Rick arrives in. Then, after roughly 90 seconds, Parker sees him first. Parker immediately leads with a joke, which is almost the Valley's way of saying hello. He tells Rick that if he had known Rick was coming, he would have asked him to bring an excavator because there is an edge that needs to be built. Rick fires back that Parker probably cannot afford him. The tension disappears almost immediately. In less than 10 seconds, 2 years of silence are pushed aside as the two men fall back into the same kind of teasing they used to have. But then, the conversation takes a turn. Neither of them expected. Parker tells Rick that he knows many people around the territory were surprised to see him back. Rick responds that they are not going to get rid of him that easily. This time, Parker does not answer with another joke. He tells Rick directly that he is a survivor. Parker explains that he has said the same thing to other people as well. No matter what else has happened between them, or what he may have said about Rick over the years, Parker has always believed that Rick is someone who survives. Rick becomes a little more serious. Then he says something that seems simple to him, but carries much more weight than he realizes. He tells Parker that he gave him his most productive and hardest working years. Rick means it as a statement about how much effort he put into the job. But Parker hears something deeper in those words, even though he does not immediately react to it. Instead, Parker does something unexpected. He takes responsibility. Parker admits that neither of them really knew what they were doing in the beginning. He says he had no idea what he was doing at the time, and Rick gave some of his best years to Parker during the years when Parker was at his worst when it came to managing people. Parker does not try to defend himself. Instead, he agrees that they worked incredibly hard and pushed themselves every day. To Rick's credit, he does not allow the conversation to turn into an old grievance. He tells Parker that he does not regret any of it. Everything he learned while working for Parker became exactly what he needed later in his own career. Rick says he feels like he has finally found that old energy again. Then Parker brings the conversation back to business. He asks Rick whether he came all the way out simply to say hello, or whether he actually needs something. Rick laughs and tells him the truth. He came to say hello, but he also needs a loader. Rick jokes that he always seems to need something from Parker. Behind the humor, though, there is obvious discomfort. Rick knows he is asking for a favor from someone he has not spoken to in 2 years. Parker does not hesitate. He says they inherited some equipment with the new claim and suggests that they go outside and take a look. The machine they find is one Parker admits he has never even used or properly inspected. It came with the purchase, part of the roughly $2 million worth of equipment that arrived with the Dominion Creek operation. It is nothing particularly impressive, and Parker says so himself. They start the machine. It fires up and runs. Rick listens to it and immediately realizes that it is exactly what he needs. Then Rick prepares himself for the part of the conversation he has been worried about since the drive over. He tells Parker that he assumes they will have to work out a deal for the machine. He admits that he has no idea what Parker is thinking. But this is where Rick's entire season changes. Parker tells him there will be no deal to negotiate. He says he hates talking about money, especially when it comes to friends. Then, Parker gives Rick the simplest answer possible. Just use it. They will figure everything out in the fall. Nothing about that arrangement is normal in the mining business. Equipment is generally rented by the hour or by the day, with the price agreed upon beforehand and payment often made up front. Machines break, seasons go badly, and nobody wants to become an unpaid creditor to a miner who is already struggling. Parker does not name an hourly rate. He does not ask for a deposit. He does not set a deadline. He does not demand security. Instead, Parker tells Rick that if he strikes the mother lode, he can give Parker a few ounces of gold as rent. Otherwise, Rick should simply take the machine and use it to get back on his feet. Because, according to Parker, that is the most important thing Rick needs to do right now. What changes hands in that moment is much more than just a loader. By leaving the terms completely open, Parker is effectively taking on the risk that Rick's season could fail. If Rick mines nothing, Parker takes the loss. In effect, Parker has just told a man who has been robbed, forced to mortgage his future, and left short-handed throughout the season that his word is enough security. And he is doing it despite being one of the people in the Yukon with the most reason to question that trust. Rick tries to respond, but he struggles to get the words out. He tells Parker that he genuinely appreciates what he is doing. He starts to acknowledge that the two of them have had their differences, but before Rick can turn it into an apology, Parker cuts him off. Parker tells him that he is not going to leave Rick in a difficult position. He wants to see Rick get back on his feet and make the season work. Then Parker tries to make the whole thing sound smaller than it really is. He calls it a pretty small gesture. He even jokes that it is at least better than telling Rick to get off his property. But Rick refuses to let Parker minimize what he has just done. Rick makes it clear that he genuinely appreciates the help, and that is what makes the moment so powerful. The season began with someone taking a piece of equipment from Rick Ness and eventually returning it damaged and covered with duct tape. Now, at the complete opposite end of the story, another man is handing Rick equipment worth real money and refusing to even put a price on it. But what Parker says after Rick leaves is where the real meaning of the moment becomes clear. About a minute and a half after Rick's truck drives away, Parker stands there and talks through what just happened. He is not thinking about the loader. He is not thinking about rent. He is not thinking about the 2 years they spent without speaking. He is thinking about one sentence Rick said. Rick had told him that he gave Parker his best years. Parker cannot stop thinking about those words because of what they suggest underneath them. Parker points out that Rick is only 42 years old, yet he is talking as though he is 90. What bothers Parker is that Rick seems to believe his best years are already gone, as though his strongest years are behind him and his future is something he has already used up. Parker calls that idea crazy. He is not simply rejecting a compliment. He is recognizing something deeper. He has just watched a man in his early 40s talk about his own life as though it belongs entirely to the past. And that realization affects Parker more than Rick's request for a loader ever did. Then, Parker explains what really concerns him. He says business is difficult enough even when someone is in a good state of mind and in a decent place in life. He hopes Rick starts doing better. Not simply making more money. Doing better. There is no business calculation behind those words. No numbers. No production target. No ledger. Parker Schnabel has built a reputation for being extremely careful with money. And after everything that happened between him and Rick, Parker had no obligation to help him at all. Yet once Rick leaves, Parker spends his private moment thinking about whether his former foreman still believes he has a future. That changes the meaning of everything that happened in the yard. Parker did not lend Rick the machine because he needed Rick's goodwill. He did not do it because he expected to make money from the deal. He did it because he listened closely enough to realize that Rick had started losing faith in his own future, and giving him a working machine with no fixed terms was the one practical way Parker could challenge that belief. Money would have felt like charity, and Rick probably would have refused it. A formal loan with a fixed rate would have been business, and it would not have carried the same meaning. Leaving the terms open said something much more important. Parker was telling Rick that he expected him to still be mining when fall came. Rick drove away with the machine. But what Parker had really given him was something far more valuable. A vote of confidence from the one person whose approval Rick had spent 2 years believing he had lost. Why it landed. The reason this moment reached so far beyond a single episode is because it does not feel like typical television. There is no major confrontation, no dramatic reveal, and no emotional moment being forced by the music. Two men who once had a serious falling out are simply standing in a muddy yard, and the man with more money quietly chooses not to make the other man pay for his help. Viewers who have followed both of their careers for more than a decade immediately recognize what is happening, because most people have experienced some version of it themselves. A friendship ends over something that felt enormous at the time, and then one small, almost unexpected gesture finally breaks the stalemate without either person needing to give a big speech. What people connected with was not simply Parker's generosity, it was his restraint. Parker had every opportunity to bring up the past and prove that he was right, but he chose not to. The practical evidence of that decision appears throughout the rest of the season. Almost everything Rick accomplishes afterward depends on that machine. He deals with a failed water pump, a pre-wash that collapses backward when its pins come loose, and a screen deck that becomes worn through with holes. Every one of those problems gets repaired. Freddie Dodge and Juan Ibarra rebuild Rocky's deck in just 4 days and install diverters that improve recovery by roughly 10%. Rick then takes a gamble on a moraine along the edge of the cheaper cut and pulls 82 ounces from the ground based on that instinct. Eventually, his crew reaches bedrock at the bottom of Raleigh Valley and produces 315.71 ounces, becoming the biggest gold haul of Rick's career. But none of those achievements happen if there is no equipment feeding the plant. Every one of those numbers can be traced back to an old loader that Parker had never even taken the time to inspect. There is an important difference between helping someone and restoring someone. Help fixes the immediate problem in front of a person. Restoration gives that person back the belief that they still have a future worth investing in. Parker managed to do the second one in less than 2 minutes, and then tried to apologize by calling it a small gesture. What was the real point? There is an honest argument to be made about what really happened that day, and there are 2 sides worth considering. One interpretation is that the gesture was simply practical. Parker had an extra machine sitting unused on a claim he had just purchased. A few ounces of gold as rent would have been a reasonable return, and helping another miner operating about 100 miles away did not really cost him much. But there is another way to look at it. Maybe the loader was never the real point. Perhaps Parker used the one form of currency 2 miners could exchange without either of them feeling embarrassed to say what he really meant. The 2 years of silence were over, and instead of making a big announcement about forgiveness or friendship, Parker simply handed Rick the keys to a machine and let the action speak for itself. So which was it? Was the loader simply a practical solution, or was it Parker's quiet way of making peace? That is the part worth debating. Share your take, because this is one of those moments that genuinely divides people. And if watching Rick's comeback story unfold is worth your time, subscribe. His journey toward 1,000 ounces is about to become much harder, and the next chapter of that comeback is already waiting.